Thank you, Pete, for praying for me. I think that's part of why time seems to be speeding up with me. Is he's there and we're here, and my thoughts are with him all the time. Paul asked me this morning. He said, "Were you caught in that torrential downpour driving with a student?" And I said, "Yeah." And he asked, "Did the student freak out?" And I said, "Yeah, a little." Truth is, I freaked out a little bit more than the student did. There's nothing like having a nervous driver and you can't see out the windshield. But I have kidded with my students, and I feel like time is speeding up. You feel like that? And I thought, if when you go into space, time slows down, why can't it speed up? I think it's speeding up. That's my thought. I heard a story about Ronald Reagan when he was president. And apparently there was a little boy that wanted $50 very badly. And he prayed and prayed the whole week. And nothing happened. He decided to write God a letter. And when the post office received the letter addressed to God, they forwarded it to the White House. And President Reagan apparently was both impressed and amused, so he instructed his aide to give the boy $5, thinking that would be a lot for him. And the boy was thrilled with the $5, and apparently he sat down and wrote another letter to God. And he said, "Dear God, thank you very much for sending the money. However, I noticed for some reason you sent it through Washington, and as usual, they kept most of it." So today, I want to, in two parts, I want to address a well-known question of Jesus, one in which he tells us what we owe God and what we owe the government. And it's the last week of Jesus' life as we're entering into Mark chapter 12, or as we have entered into Mark chapter 12. Right now we're covering verses 13 to 17. And he has just finished telling a powerful, in-your-face parable with an application specifically designed and pointed toward the religious leaders. And in that parable, Jesus focuses in on God's patience and goodness. Although it might not seem that way when we read that parable straight on, that's really what he's focused on. But he clearly lets the leaders know through that parable that there's going to come a point when God will say, "Enough," and judgment will come. And remember, right before he told this parable, he had gone into the temple courts and he had, in a dramatic fashion, cleared it out. And the religious leaders, right after that, came up and questioned him and said, "Who gave you the authority to clear out the temple?" And they tried to trick Jesus at that time to say something that they could use against him. And as usual, Jesus shut them down pretty quick. And then right after he told that parable to the leaders and to the people that were there, and we know, I went through the numbers, there was probably many people there. And as you can imagine, these guys, these leaders, they did not appreciate being called out by Christ. They understood the parable. They understood exactly what Jesus was saying to them. But the interesting thing, and Jenny brought this up in our discussion last week after the service, they weren't afraid of God's judgment. They were afraid of the people. Mark chapter 12, verse 12. And they were seeking to arrest him, meaning Jesus, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told a parable against them, so they left him and went away. Can you imagine? No fear of God, but a fear of the people. So because they couldn't arrest him at that point, they regrouped and they came up with another plan. And according to Mark chapter 12, verse 13, it says, "And they sent him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk." Now these guys were no doubt selected because of their shrewdness. I don't know of another word to use. They were smooth talkers. The word trap means to ensnare. It's talking about a word that is used to catch a bird or some wild animal with a net. So instead of this frontal attack, they resorted to some stealthy ambush from the side. In a parallel account in Matthew chapter 22, verse 13, it mentions that they plotted how to entangle him in his words. I heard Merriam-Webster Dictionary released a while back 250 new words and redefinitions a little while ago. And one of the words was troll. Now, I don't know if you know the original definition of troll. It comes from, I'm Scandinavian, it comes from an old Scandinavian folklore, and it was a creature. It's now a verb, not a noun, and it means, quote, to antagonize others online by deliberately posting inflammatory or irrelevant and offensive comments or other disruptive content. If the Pharisees and the Herodians had Facebook or Twitter, or X, they would be trolling Jesus for sure. But since they didn't, they were seeking to trap him face to face with his own words. And with that as a background, let's read our passage. Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. "And they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, 'Teacher, we know you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?' But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, 'Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarii and let me look at it.' And they brought him one. And he said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is this?' And they said to him, 'Caesar's.' And Jesus said to them, 'Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And they marveled at him." Luke 20:21 refers to this select group of Pharisees and Herodians as actual spies. And here is what a lot of people don't realize. The Pharisees and the Herodians represented opposite ends of the political spectrum of that day. Sounds similar, right? Just as our country is filled with this kind of polarizing political parties, we have Republicans and Democrats. Then in the middle we have the independents. But we're seeking it, we're seeing it not only with our Republicans and Democrats, we're seeing it in news channels. We're seeing it in professional sports. The political climate at that time was a powder keg just like it is today. And here's a quick explanation of the differences of those two groups. Herodians were secular. The Pharisees were spiritual. Herodians were about government. The Pharisees were about God. Now, if we stop there, it makes the Pharisees look good, right? Let's keep going. Herodians were pro-Herod. The Pharisees were anti-Herod. Herodians were pro-tax. The Pharisees were anti-tax, but they both hated Jesus. They had totally opposite agendas and political platforms. The bottom line is that the Herodians feared that Jesus was going to undermine the rule of Herod, and the Pharisees wondered and were worried that he would upstage the religion and steal their authority and cause problems with their strength with Rome. We don't see this written down specifically in Scripture, but that was the atmosphere. That was what was going on. And the Pharisees wanted to accuse him of heresy. The Herodians wanted to charge him with treason. But they both wanted him dead. And these two groups come together against a common enemy. Sound familiar? They're living out the ancient saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We see that even today, when people who despise each other's beliefs, they're coming together to stand against Jesus Christ. We're reminded of this in Psalm chapter 2, verse 2. It says, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. And that is only going to become accented as time goes on. So these leaders begin to use flattery, a psychological trick to soften up Jesus Christ. They're living out Psalm 145. It says, the arrogant have hidden a trap for me. And these spies use a very respectful title, teacher. And they're trying to affirm him. They're trying to admire his integrity. We know that you are true. In addition, they recognize that he doesn't consult polls, stating his positions, and that would be a really refreshing thing in our day, wouldn't it? I don't consult polls. He says, they say you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Wow. Can you imagine if we had politicians like that? Everything they said about Jesus was true, but they didn't believe any of it. They identify him as one who truly teaches the way of God. They knew that he taught the way of God. But they wouldn't submit to the will of God. And we see that in our culture as well, constantly, over and over and over again. People say, and I don't know how many articles you've read, I sit down, I read the news every day. Why, I don't know, but I do. And constantly I'm seeing people say kind things about Christ, but they're not submitting to the one who is the way. Thinking they have Jesus right where they want him, these political power players, they craft a question that they believe is going to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place. And at the end of verse 14, they ask Jesus a question. Actually, it's two questions. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? And this was the question of the day. And they wanted Jesus to answer so that they could attack him. Gotcha! You said it. We got you. And the question that they posed is designed to solicit a yes or no answer. The topic of taxes is always volatile. Back then and today. Tax reform is in the national headlines again. Any of you go food shopping recently? I'm amazed at the price of certain kinds of foods. Have you ever gone to the checkout counter and they say, do you want a bag? Well, that'll be 10 cents, that'll be $1. What in the world? And there's a charge plus tax. Do you notice that? There's a charge, 10 cents for the bag, but there's tax on that. And if you haven't noticed, taxes have gone up. Taxes are higher everywhere, but there are some cities that they have skyrocketed, like Chicago, where there are 30 separate taxes. Can you believe that? The Israelites, during the time of Jesus, they had taxes, but they resisted them because taxes were a reminder that they were under the control of Rome. That's what they were designed for. And of course, money. Income tax was 1% at that time. Ground tax, 10% of grain, 20% of oil and wine. Business tax, when goods were transported to different cities, there was a tax that was collected. And this was the job, by the way, of Matthew, the disciple, when he left everything to follow Christ, Matthew 9:9. There was a poll tax. That was 1 day's wage, a denarii. And note that this is the same tax levied by Caesar Augustus when he was calling for a census in God's, when Jesus was born, and that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. See, a lot of us, we think they were going to just worship, but they were going because they had to go to their hometown to pay tax too. And the taking of a census, that infuriated the Jews because it reminded them that they were under the dominion of Rome, and they particularly hated that particular tax because it was kind of a loyalty litmus test. But get this, the Jewish leaders also had a tax. There was a temple tax. A tax on all offerings. As much as they hated Rome, they imitated it. And that was why Jesus came in and overturned the tables, the tax tables in the temple. They were robbing the people for the money. And that's what the tax was used for, basically. It's difficult to want to pay taxes, it's difficult to want to pay taxes when you disagree with how they're used. Right? Yet you can't live without paying them. We're stuck. Taxpayer taxes subsidize abortions for women covered by Medicaid and state employee insurance. Right to Life estimates this decision will lead to thousands of additional abortions each year. And it's troubling to me that my payment of my taxes are used to fund abortions. And don't get me started on the illegal immigrants. Do you know that our taxes pay for their lodging, for their food, for their work permits, for their health insurance, and get this, even their child care? Yeah. Do you know how many people I know that had to vacate their jobs in order to care for the children at home because they couldn't afford child care, so they quit their jobs? Look, it's not the immigrants' fault. It's not their fault at all. Because they couldn't, I mean, let's face it, who wouldn't want to come to America today? You're living in poverty in another country, and you can come to America for free and get all these benefits. I'd do it in a heartbeat. Wouldn't you? I know you would. It's not their fault. I do exactly what they're doing, but my tax dollars also are funding education, where they're telling a boy that he's a girl and a girl that she's a boy. Where does it stop? I'm angry about that, but there's not a whole lot I can do because I got to pay my taxes. Warren Wiersbe summarizes it up like this. And again, I do believe that our times are reflective of what was going on then. He says this: if Jesus opposed the tax, he would be in trouble with Rome. If he approved the tax, he would be in trouble with the Jews. Depending on how we answered, either the Herodians would have him arrested or the Pharisees would finally have the evidence they needed. So which would it be? Would he be an enemy of God or an enemy of the government? Now, a little bit of historical background is going to be helpful for us here. When Judea became a Roman province in AD 6, a census was taken so the Romans could enforce a head tax. And a Jewish nationalist named Judas, not the Judas you might be thinking of, totally different Judas, and he led a revolt against this tax because he didn't want this tax revenue used to pay for an army that oppressed him. And we learn about that uprising and how it was crushed in Acts chapter 5, verse 37. It says this: after him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Their hope in Jesus is going to take their bait to the trap that they're setting and do exactly what Judas did. And instead of going one side or the other, to the right or to the left, Jesus goes up. And he raises everything to a higher plane. And these enemies start out flattering Jesus, and then he flattens them. Jesus sees right through the phoniness of the Pharisees and the hatred of the Herodians. And I imagine they're kind of walking around, high-fiving each other like, yeah, we got him now. We got him. What's he going to do? One of us has him. But that didn't last long, because look at verse 15. But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarii and let me look at it. In Luke 20:23, it says that Jesus knew their craftiness. In Mark 22:18, it describes that Jesus knew their wickedness. And as spies, that's what they were. They were sly, they were slick, they were shrewd, they were smooth. And these guys were phonies, and they weren't interested at all in doing what was right. They just wanted Jesus to incriminate himself. And before they can say anything, Jesus asks for the coin used to pay the tax. Now I can just picture this scene. Hey, you got a denarii? Show me a denarii. I can just imagine they're all digging into their pockets, and into their robes, much like we do when we're told, you get to the cash register and they say that's $5.15. And we give the cashier a 10, and the cashier looks back at us and says, I'm low on ones. Do you happen to have 15 cents? It's interesting that Jesus does not have one of these coins in his possession. So the Pharisees, and we know that Jesus didn't carry any credit cards. So the Pharisees, they were probably excited to give him one because maybe they thought he was going to side with them and that was going to alienate the Herodians. But asking for a coin throws them totally off guard. And as they dig through their pockets to come up with one, I'm sure that they were sitting there going, what in the world is going on here? What's his intentions? And Jesus holds up a denarii that's used to pay the poll tax. And it was minted in Rome, was made out of silver, and coins were used to spread propaganda in that day to remind everyone that they were a subject of Rome. So every time they pulled out a coin, they saw it. And Jesus shows the head side, and everyone sees the head of the emperor, the inscription, Tiberius Caesar, Augustus, son of divine Augustus. And on the tail side is a female figure seated on a throne wearing a crown with these words, High Priest. And the coin was, in effect, it was a portable idol promoting pagan idolatry. Do you realize that? Every time they paid for anything, that's what they saw. And incidentally, a denarii was worth a day's wages for a soldier. To put it in context, using the average amount that a soldier makes today, and I know a little bit about that, I'll know a whole lot more as time goes on, but it's probably anywhere from $75 to $150. No wonder they didn't want to pay the tax. Now remember, everybody's watching Jesus. And there was a lot of people there. And I can think of maybe a few reasons why Jesus asked for a coin, because he didn't have one. It shows us that he was poor, because he carried no money. He wanted everybody to see the leaders had a coin with an idol on it, and it didn't seem to bother them at all. Maybe this teaching method got them personally involved as they watched him touch and look at the coin. Jesus is moving the discussion from public politics to spiritual principle. Jesus was always teaching. And with everybody looking at Christ and the coin, or maybe they picked a coin out of their own pocket, and we're looking at it as Jesus was looking at the coin that they were looking at, they all heard Jesus ask, whose likeness and inscription is this? And the answer is obvious, so they respond quickly, but then they realize the implications of what they said. And at that point, Jesus has them right where he wants them. I picture Jesus kind of flipping the coin back to whoever gave it to him. Psalm 9:16, it says, the wicked are ensnared in the work of their own hands. And the tables have turned at this point, and they now need to answer Christ's question at the end of verse 16. And he said to them, or they said to him, it's Caesar's picture. And I love how Jesus drives his point home in verse 17. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. To render literally means to give back what is his, to deliver or return, to give back in full. So essentially he's saying the coin belongs to Caesar, so give it back to him. And the very grammar that Jesus uses here is possessive. Whose likeness and inscription is this? Their taxes were not optional. Instead, they were an obligation, and Caesar is due the denarii because he owns the denarii. And I just want to stop here, and next week we'll cover part 2. But let's linger here a bit and walk through what the Bible says about our responsibility to our government. And then next week we'll talk about our responsibilities to God. Our responsibilities to the government. I see at least 4 obligations we have to the government, and they came from a guy named Pastor Brian Bell. He's been a stimulus for this message, and a guy named Pastor Ken Trent. Number 1, obey. Romans 13, 1-2. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I had a friend of mine that was a police officer. He used to quote this to me. Not because I was opposed to police, but just verifying his job. So we're to obey our authorities or stand against them, understanding that there's going to be consequences. Many Christians at that time, they stood against, and then they lined up in the arena and they faced death. But they knew that that was the consequence of standing up. We stand with God, but understanding that he also has allowed the government to rule. So unless something conflicts with God's law, we obey, even if we disagree. And if it does, we stand against it. But we need to understand that there's going to be consequences of standing against it and be willing to accept those. Second, pay. Romans 13:6-7. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. We pay our taxes to the authorities because that is our obligation, even if we don't like it. Now, we know a lot of people that don't pay their taxes, and they find ways around it. But in our hearts, this is what we're told to do by God. So, we pay our taxes. And side note, we also pay our tithe. I get a tip of $50, 10% goes to God. God doesn't need that. No, I do. Because that's what I'm told to do. We pay our taxes to the authorities because it's our obligation, even if we don't like it. And we can express ourselves with our voice and our vote, but ultimately we pay our taxes because God has set up the government, and we can't really live unless we do. And this reminds me of a person that realized he didn't pay enough tax. So he sent an anonymous letter to the IRS. And he said, "My conscience is bothering me. Enclosed you will find $175 which I owe in taxes. ... If my conscience continues to bother me, I'll send you the rest." Did you know that the IRS has truckloads of anonymous letters like that? We need to pay, because that's what God tells us. Third, we need to pray. And I'm convicted big time on this one. 1 Timothy 2:1-2. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. I was convicted because, honestly, I haven't been praying for our president. I don't like him. There, I said it. But what's worse, I haven't been praying for the guy. And I'm wrong. I'm dead wrong on that. So I was convicted. I need to pray for this guy, that God would infiltrate his heart and his mind. We all do. Even if we don't like him. It doesn't matter. We're told to pray. And number 4, stay. Titus 3:1-2. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Let the government see us doing good things, and make sure we're not giving Christ a bad name for what we say and do. And I don't know about you, but I'm reading too many articles where Christians, quote, are standing up and saying nasty, mean things that are not kind. That should not be us. Let's live in peace. Let's be considerate of other citizens, even if we don't agree with them. And as Americans, we have the right and the privilege to be involved because we live in a democracy. Don't pull out. Stay involved. And vote on your values and live on mission where God has put you, has put us. We can get angry and disgusted at the things that are going on. But if we sit there and we do nothing and we don't vote, really, I'm angered when I hear Christians say, what difference does it make? I'm just not going to vote. Really? Really? That's a right that you have. That's a right that we have. Vote. Vote on your values. Speak up when you have the opportunity. Not in an angry way, in a right way. The bottom line here is God, God. Then we pray to Him to handle what we cannot. We trust in that. Should we speak up when we see things that are going wrong in terms of value? Yes, and vote. Again, I think it's wrong to say it doesn't matter if I vote. It doesn't matter, it's going to come out the way it's going to come out. Nevertheless, we step up there and we do what we're called to do. That's wrong thinking. To not vote. To not speak up. We pray, we vote, we speak up when we can, and then we leave the rest up to God, because God is God. And God is in control. And we are a child of His. And then we pray some more. Why? Because God's God and His hand is everywhere and it's orchestrating His plan in His way. So we sit back and we rest in that. We don't understand it. I had a problem this morning. I read about Jacob. He wrestled with Jesus, I believe. And his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. And then he goes out to meet Esau. And Esau wanted to kill him 20, 25 years, 30 years previously. And so he sends all these people ahead of him to appease Esau. And then, as I read this morning, Esau saw him and he jumped off his horse, ran to him, embraced him, kissed him. And insisted that Jacob not give him any gifts. Jacob insisted they're his. And so he took them because Jacob insisted. And then he said, "Come with me, brother." And Jacob said, "You go ahead. I have so many flocks. I have so many." And he went the other direction. I said, God, I don't understand that. Esau just showed his love. He showed his forgiveness. And Jacob, he goes in the other direction. I don't get it, God. I don't understand it. Now I know in time, God's going to make that clear to me. But there's a lot of times we have things in our lives we don't get. We don't understand. It almost seems the opposite. God has a plan. God's in control because God is God. And we're His child. So with those things that we can't comprehend, that we don't understand, we just trust. Yes, it's tough. But we rest in His arms. And that's why we celebrate communion each week. And if any of us say that we understand why he sent Jesus to die for us. We're not being truthful because we can't understand it. We can't understand that love. We rest in it. And that's what communion is really all about. Letting God be God.